Welcome, everybody. We are diving into the world of economics and governance today. And let me tell you, the sources you've given me are fascinating.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild intersection, especially now.
Right. Like we're at this crazy point where technology is changing everything.
Really is. It's like the old rules are being rewritten.
Totally. And one of these sources, I mean, they really go for it, trying to rebuild like our whole understanding of economic systems, but just starting with logic.
Oh, I think I know which one you're talking about. Yeah, that was a mind bender for sure.
It was kind of awesome, though, right?
Totally. And it makes you think, like, if we could start from scratch, knowing what we know now,
Could we actually design something better?
right, something more efficient, more fair, more adaptable. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is, and it's not just theoretical anymore. This isn't some like distant future. We're seeing this play out right now.
Oh, absolutely. Technology is forcing us to confront these questions head on.
Like with this whole idea of property, right? One source, they had this thought experiment, almost like a joke, but it makes you think.
Let me guess. It involves a desert island.
Close. Two people, Alice and Bob, and they both claim to own the entire universe.
Okay, yeah, I remember that one. Wild, right? But it really gets to the heart of what it means to own something.
And whether it even makes sense to talk about ownership in the same way when we're talking about like digital stuff.
Exactly. Like, what are the costs of actually securing that ownership? In the real world, you can put up a fence, right?
Yeah.
But what about in the digital world?
It's a whole different ball game. Which makes me think about this other source that was talking about digital currencies, like Bitcoin, that whole decentralized thing.
Right, because if money itself becomes digital, then those systems of ownership of exchange,
Mm.
they become even more crucial.
Because there's no central bank, no government to step in.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of a trusted contract host comes into play. We need some way to make sure those digital interactions are fair, secure, transparent.
And one source brought up blockchain as a potential solution here. Have you, I mean, blockchain's a whole other can of worms,
Well,
but
it's relevant here because blockchain, it's all about creating these tamper-proof records, right? So you can imagine how that could be huge for contracts, property rights, even governance itself.
wow. Okay. So we're talking about like actually using code to enshrine these ideals. It's almost like
Like those we the people ideals.
exactly, but it makes you wonder, right? Like if these systems are going to rely on everyone participating.
How do we make sure people are actually equipped to handle that? It's a huge question.
It is. And it's connected to this other big idea from the sources, information overload. Like we've got all this data flying around.
It's only going to get more intense, right?
Right. So how do we make sense of it all?
Well, one of the sources talked about this idea of social physics, using big data to understand how we behave and design better systems. Like, imagine if we could use data to design smarter cities.
Or personalize healthcare treatments based on someone's specific individual data.
Exactly. The potential is huge.
Hmm.
But of course, we have to be so careful, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've all heard the horror stories. Data breaches, privacy violations, algorithms being used to manipulate people.
Exactly. The Snowden revelations, that was a huge wake-up call. We need strong ethical frameworks, data privacy regulations. We can't just hand over all this power without safeguards.
We need to be really thoughtful about how we're using these tools. It can't just be about the cool factor, right? We need to think long term about the
Well, it's
consequences.
like we're trying to build the plane while we're flying it.
Mm.
We need innovation, for sure, but we also need some serious caution.
100%. And speaking of analogies, one source compared this whole digital revolution to something kind of surprising, the agricultural revolution. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first.
It seems weird, right? But their point was that both revolutions led to this massive surplus.
But instead of food, it's information this time around.
Exactly. And that creates a need for new systems, new ways of organizing ourselves. Think about it. The agricultural revolution led to the rise of nation states.
So, what does that mean for us now? Are we going to see the rise of like digital nations or something?
Some people think so. Look at what's happening with platforms like Airbnb, Lyft, even Bitcoin. They're challenging the old centralized models in a big way.
Yeah, it really does feel like the old maps aren't cutting it anymore. We need something new.
We do. We need a new map for a world where information is power, and it's flowing in ways we never could have imagined before.
It's like we're trying to figure out the rules of the road for this whole digital world, right?
Absolutely. And one of the sources made this really interesting connection, talking about how these digital spaces we're in, they're kind of like those shared physical commons.
Oh, Oh, right, like parks and stuff.
Exactly. And we're so used to thinking about shared physical resources, but online, it gets tricky.
Yeah, it's not like you can just like put a fence around a website, right?
Right. So how do you manage those resources? How do you make sure everyone benefits and nobody's like digitally trashing the place?
It's funny, it's like those pool rules we talked about before. Even in a tiny space, you need some kind of agreement.
Exactly. And the stakes are so much higher online. Think about the spread of misinformation or echo chambers where people only see what they already agree with.
Yeah, that's scary stuff. One source actually used the term tragedy of the commons, but like applied to the digital world.
Oh, right, where everyone acts in their own self-interest and it ends up hurting everyone in the long run.
Exactly. It's like overfishing, right? If everybody takes too much, eventually there's nothing left for anyone.
And online, it's not always as obvious when we're depleting the resource. It could be something like trust or attention,
Yeah.
even our sense of shared reality.
Okay, so that's pretty bleak. Is there any hope here? Like, how do we design these digital spaces so they don't turn into a dystopian free-for-all?
Well, this is where things get really interesting because some people believe blockchain could be a big part of the solution.
Blockchain. Again, I mean, I know we touched on it before, but...
It keeps coming up for a reason
Mm-hmm.
because at its core, blockchain is about decentralization and transparency.
Hmm.
So instead of having like one central authority controlling everything,
It's more like a shared responsibility.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that shared responsibility, that's what could incentivize people to protect those digital commons.
Interesting. Because everyone has a stake in it working. Right.
Now, it's not a silver bullet. There's still huge challenges to figure out, but it's definitely a tool worth exploring.
Okay, so we've talked about property, we've talked about commons,
Yeah.
but this whole thing about a social contract for the digital age, that really got me thinking.
Yeah. It's almost like we need a whole new set of agreements for how we interact with each other online.
And with technology itself, right?
Absolutely. Like, what are the fundamental rights and responsibilities that come with being a digital citizen?
It's almost like we need a, what do you call it, a digital bill of rights or something to guarantee things like privacy and security.
Exactly. And to ensure that these digital spaces we're building, they actually reflect our values.
Which brings us back to this whole distributed operating system idea, right? But like, how do you actually make something that radical work in the real world?
Well, one source pointed to the open source software movement as a potential model. Imagine if governance was more like an open source project.
Where anyone could contribute, make suggestions.
Exactly. It would require a huge shift in how we think about power and participation.
Instead of being governed, it's more like we're governing ourselves collaboratively.
Precisely. And while it's not without its challenges, it's incredibly exciting to imagine the possibilities.
I mean, it's a completely different way of thinking about how we organize ourselves.
Right. And it gets even wilder. One source actually talked about like downloading your democracy.
Wait, what? How do you download a democracy? That sounds like something out of like a video game or something.
Right. It sounds kind of out there, but the idea is that instead of being, bound by geography, by whatever country you happen to be born in.
You could choose to participate in different systems online based on what you care about most.
Exactly. Like imagine joining a global community dedicated to climate action. Or maybe there's a decentralized network focused on a specific social justice issue that really speaks to you.
So you'd be linking up with people from all over the world who share your values.
Exactly. And those digital communities, they could have their own ways of making decisions, their own rules, even their own ways of enforcing those rules, all powered by these new technologies.
Okay, so that's the digital side, but wouldn't that be super hard to separate from the real world? Like, what happens when those digital decisions have real world consequences?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something we need to be thinking about right now. As we're building these systems, we have to make sure they're designed with the real world in mind.
So it's not enough to just make cool technology. We also have to think about the ethics of it all.
Exactly. We can't just hand over all this power to algorithms and say, okay, go govern us now. We need human values baked into these systems from the ground up.
We have to be really intentional about the kind of future we're building with all of this.
100%. One source put it really well. They said, technology is agnostic.
Meaning it doesn't care if we use it for good or evil.
Exactly. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used to build amazing things, or it can be used to cause harm. It all depends on us.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we've covered a ton of ground here. What's the takeaway message for someone listening to all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. The future is not predetermined. It's not this fixed thing that's just going to happen to us.
We still have a say in how it all unfolds.
Exactly.